How did Rome really collapse? When most people imagine the fall of Rome, they immediately think of barbarians storming the gates, destroyed walls, or palace conspiracies. But the truth is, great empires never collapse overnight. They weaken from within first. And most of the time, the main reason comes down to one thing: money. Rome did not fall only because of invasions. Its economy collapsed, its currency lost its value, and the lessons we can learn from this are still relevant today. At the time, ordinary people were watching everything change with their own eyes. Prices were rising constantly, because the money they used no longer had the same value. A handful of wheat that could once be bought with a single denarius eventually cost tens of thousands of denarii. Unfortunately, this was not just about numbers. It was a crisis that completely disrupted people's everyday lives. Soldiers demanded higher wages just to survive. Merchants refused to accept coins that had lost their value, choosing gold or barter instead. When people stopped trusting money in the economy, trade slowly began returning to an older system. But what was the government doing during all of this? Instead of solving the problem, it was busy producing even more devalued currency. It may have seemed like a logical solution, but the opposite happened. Because once trust in a currency disappears, no matter how much money you print, people will never value it the same way again. This was the vicious cycle Rome found itself trapped in. This crisis reached its peak during the period known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Between AD 235 and 284, Rome experienced nearly 50 years of continuous disasters, invasions, epidemics, civil wars. Emperors would stay on the throne for only a few months before being killed and replaced by someone else. But behind all this political chaos, there was an even more dangerous problem. The economy was collapsing. Taxes were being collected in money that was losing value every day. Farmers began abandoning their lands because they could no longer afford to pay their taxes. Trade networks were breaking apart, and the state was desperately searching for solutions. They tried controlling prices. They forced people to continue working, but unfortunately, none of it worked. Eventually, Emperor Diocletian introduced the edict on maximum prices in AD 301, setting government-controlled maximum prices for hundreds of goods and services. Everything from grain prices to worker wages was regulated. The punishment for those who ignored the rules was, unfortunately, death. But creating laws could not make a worthless currency valuable again. In fact, black markets grew, while official trade nearly came to a complete stop. People had learned a very important truth: no law can restore value to money that has lost people's trust. Eventually, Rome had to abandon the denarius completely. Around AD 312, Emperor Constantine introduced a new currency called the solidus, made from pure gold. This currency brought stability to the Eastern Roman Empire for many years, but for the Western Roman Empire it was already too late. The foundation of the economy had been destroyed. The army could no longer be financed as it once had been. Trade networks had fallen apart, and most importantly, people had completely lost their trust in both the government and its money. Rome did not collapse because of a single battle. It slowly fell after years of economic decline, and one of the most important reasons behind this collapse was the destruction of the value of its own currency. But what does all of this mean for us today? The answer is actually simple, yet extremely important. When the value of a currency begins to decline, ordinary people are the ones who eventually pay the price. Rome experienced this, but history did not end there. Centuries passed, and the same story repeated itself in different countries around the world. Take Germany after the First World War, for example. After the war, the country was buried under enormous debts. To deal with this burden, the government started printing more and more money. At first, they believed this would solve the problem, but things quickly moved in the opposite direction. By 1923, hyperinflation had spiraled completely out of control. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark before the war eventually reached prices of hundreds of billions of marks. People were carrying their salaries in suitcases, and even in wheelbarrows. Savings that had taken a lifetime to build disappeared almost overnight. But the interesting part was this: people who had debts were able to pay them off easily, because inflation reduced the real value of what they owed. However, millions of people who kept their money in banks, lived on fixed salaries, or depended on pensions, lost almost everything they had saved. The economic collapse did not only empty people's wallets, it also destroyed society's hope, and according to many historians, this environment became one of the major factors that later helped create the conditions for the rise of Hitler. A similar story happened in Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. Production declined, debts increased, and once again the government saw printing money as the solution. The result? By 2008, inflation had reached such extreme levels that prices were increasing 2 or 3 times within days. Store workers could barely keep up with changing price tags. Eventually, the country was forced to abandon its own currency completely. People began using the US dollar and the South African rand for everyday purchases. Once again, the same pattern appeared. They tried to change reality, but the economy refused to cooperate. But are these only extreme examples from history? Actually, no. Even in the world's largest economies, similar discussions continue today. Take the United States, for example. In 1971, President Richard Nixon removed the dollar from the gold standard. This This meant the dollar was no longer backed by gold. Its value became based entirely on trust from people and financial markets. This system is known as fiat money. In the following decades, government debt continued to grow. The money supply expanded, and inflation became one of the most discussed economic issues. Of course, today nobody is carrying their salary in a wheelbarrow, but people's purchasing power has slowly declined over time. In 1971, $1 could buy many things that require several times more money to purchase today. The banknote is the same. The color is the same. The images printed on it are the same, but its purchasing power is no longer the same. And this leads history to ask us the same question again and again. What gives money its true value? Is it the paper itself, or is it the endless trust people place in it? So what does all of this tell us about the future? Perhaps this is the most important part, because today we are not talking about only one country's monetary system. Rome's problems affected Rome. The crisis of Weimar Germany shook Germany. Zimbabwe's collapse mostly remained within its own borders. But the world today is very different. Almost every country now uses a fiat currency system. Government debts are at historic levels, and central banks can inject trillions of dollars into markets during economic crises. This means that a major financial shock today could have far more destructive consequences than crises of the past, because economies are now more connected than ever before. So what should ordinary people do in a world like this? The story of Rome teaches us three important lessons. First, trust in money is often more valuable than the money itself. When confidence in a currency disappears, rebuilding that trust can take years. Second, true wealth is not only the number written in a bank account. Knowledge to be skills. The ability to create and produce land, businesses. In other words, assets that create real value are often much more resilient than paper money during difficult times. Third, and perhaps the most important lesson, no economic system lasts forever. If you had told a Roman living in the 1st century, one day, the money you use will lose almost all of its value, they would probably have laughed at you. If you had told someone living in Germany in 1913, people will one day carry their salaries in wheelbarrows, they would not have believed you. If you had told someone in Zimbabwe during the 1980s, your country will completely abandon its own currency, they would have thought it was impossible. But all of these things happened exactly as predicted. That is why history matters, because major crises usually never begin overnight. They develop slowly and quietly. People get used to them. Problems are ignored, and then one day, a massive collapse happens that nobody expected. The fall of Rome happened in exactly this way. Barbarian armies may have delivered the final blow, but what truly weakened the empire was years of internal economic decay and the loss of trust. Perhaps that is why historians often repeat the same saying. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. Knowing the past does not allow us to predict the future with certainty, but it does reduce the chance of making the same mistakes again, and perhaps that is the greatest benefit of studying history, because empires change, leaders change, currencies change, but human nature almost never changes.